Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, to this afternoon session in Aix-en-Provence. I'm Emmanuel KESSLER. I'm the president of the parliamentary channel LCP-AN, channel 8 on TNT. That's for ad purposes. So, how about economic growth and fair taxation, the impossible balance? I am lucky to moderate this wonderful session on this terrible debate. I'm not sure you have read about the controversies in the French press on the budget and the parliament discussions, but also will have an international dimension. So before introducing the main speakers in this debate that will allow you also, that will also give you an opportunity to have a Q&A session, I'm going to give the floor to Pierre, first of all, who's the representative of the Cercle des économistes, who was in charge of coordinating this debate. Pierre, hello. You're professor at the Department of Finance of the Polytechnic Institute. You're a researcher at the Public Studies. So the impossible balance between growth and fair taxation, there's not even a question mark. Do you think it's relevant? And maybe you can lay the foundations of this discussion. Thank you for giving me the floor. Do we need to choose between economic growth and fair taxation? If we want to be optimistic, we'll say yes to this question and delve into something else altogether straight away. But we are very optimistic here, and our history has shown that we managed to have a high level of economic development whilst maintaining high fair taxation. Taxation equity. How can we facilitate the redistribution of a pie whose size is increasing? That's a message of hope, but also that needs adjustment for the emerging countries. Today in France, we redistribute a lot, but we're talking about a pie that is smaller. This is 20% in India, 13% in Uganda, but the growth is 8% in India, 7% in Uganda, where we reach 1%, and it's actually hard to reach 1% in France. Our debt increases to fund our lifestyle. Companies do not invest in breakthrough innovations, and households find it difficult to make both ends meet. So it is hard to find the balance between growth and fair taxation, and to do so democratically. What is the role of taxation in a society? Here, the important notion is consent to taxation, and it is essential. But we can say that in France it's fragile, and we cannot be considered as something vested. So the barometer of the Council of Mandatory levies and good use of public spending are actually the main elements of consent to taxation. Another lesson is anything that regards inheritance is actually the less popular if we take the standpoint of the parents, but it's not the same thing as if we think about the children if they have to receive inheritance depending on their birthplace. The difference between taxation and use was not actually a promising venue. So we saw that promising the French people that we could deduct the amount of donations to associations from taxes could actually increase and foster consent to taxation. How can we do more with less? We need some time to do spending in ecological transition, national defense, whilst we observe continually changes in public policies. We need to improve our social fiscal systems to combine fair taxation and equity. How can we have a social pact and a tax pact? How can we which answer is going to be given by the speakers? I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. You've talked about hot potatoes. It will be very interesting to listen to the speakers. All those that read the media, you certainly referred to a lot of headlines that will be important. So Véronique McKenzie is also a speaker. She's a partner and responsible in charge of taxation within McKenzie firm. That's one of the main lawyer firms of Paris, and dealing with consultancy in terms of taxation worldwide. The president of the European Central Bank was also a partner before you of this firm, so that actually is very promising for you within McKenzie. Gérard BEKERMAN, you know him, he's the president of AFER. the French Association of Savings and Retirement Funds, 57 billions under management, and he's about to renew. He's just renewed his 5-year term of office, because we have more 5-year terms of office than for French presidents of the Republic. Then we have Mr. GGOOBI. He's one of the main stakeholders of public generosity, with 12,000 projects funded in 2024. We're talking about 300 million annual donations. You have a long career as a diplomat. You were a French ambassador. You committed a lot in the EU. You were at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs until 2014. We're talking about the international dimension. We'll have it also with McKenzie, who's the president of the Institute for Economic Growth, also the chairman of the 15th Commission of India, 15th Commission, which is a commission in charge of working on mandatory levies and taxes. Everything that is deducted and everything that is redistributed in terms of public spending. Then we have Ramathan, who's an economist. You have a solid academic career already behind you. You also have a political and administrative career, very international. You are today your Secretary of the Treasury in the Republic of Uganda. Welcome to you in Aix-en-Provence for the Rencontre Économique. So the first question will start. Véronique, MILLISCHER, because we are actually at a crossroads in terms of public spending. We're talking about corporations that you know very well, because you know the situation very well. It's very specific also. So whilst we have a very stressed budget situation with a lot of debt and a score that has been downgraded, what about the relationship with taxation? Isn't it indispensable to have the public finance back on tracks? And should we target budget for maybe we could target taxation and focus on the corporations with the highest revenue, especially in France? This is a vast subject, obviously, and this is really a hot topic. I would like rather to talk about companies, which I advise, of all sizes and formats, because the question of taxation is the same, whatever the company size, irrespective of the size. Taxation is a financial data to manage for companies. Can we hear her well? Can you hear her well? Please keep the mic close to you, otherwise it's going to be impossible. So it is a financial data, just like any other financial parameter to be managed by the company. And what is very important for the company is to have a long-term vision. This morning, I was attending the session on territorial gaps, and they said what is missing is a long-term vision of the subject, and taxation is the same problem. So what is important is to have a system that is stable, that can be foreseeable and consistent. And if we need more taxation, because we've seen the status of public budget and finance, we know that if we don't pay more taxation, we won't adjust the public finance. But we need a framework. When companies hear that the research tax credit is a fiscal niche that costs 8 billion euros and maybe we'll cancel it altogether and we'll have 8 billion back, it's actually a fallacy, because the research tax credit has been existing since 1923. It has proved its efficiency, and it has improved and boosted the activity of important sectors of the economy, organizing themselves around this, and it's an important parameter. And it would be very dangerous to cancel it altogether. So, yes, I would say yes to participate to the collective effort. However, we shouldn't do it by changing every day our stance on the subject. It's not all or nothing in terms of taxation, because we could revisit the research tax credit for those that have used it for excessive tax optimization purposes, and maybe we could keep the intent and letter for companies for which it is an important tool. Indeed, for when we talk about incentives, well, sometimes we have also frauds that are combined with it, and unfortunately, it goes often hand in hand together, and they shouldn't exist anymore, or they need to be repressed. So we have to tackle the merits of the case, and these are important these fiscal niches are actually very important for the growth of the economy. We have to be aware that we shouldn't we shouldn't discontinue growth drivers in the name of because of frauds. So do you share your colleagues' opinion? Well, thank you for your concision, Véronique, first of all. How brief should I be? Because I prepared something lasting 1 hour, but I could sum it up in 1 minute if you want me. So you'd rather have 1 minute? Yes, of course. So that's my conclusion. First of all, tax was created at a time when France had just lost 7 million had sustained 7 million casualties because of the war, and we had something else in mind. Something else to take into consideration at the time. The focus had been put on family, health, and old age. Then, after decades, there has been an evolution in the state missions that were allocated to the state, and that has nothing to do with taxation. And we have seen the state dealing with everything at once, except what is essential. And this is why we are reaching a situation where we have 3,000 billion euros of public debt, and we can't refund. And so the state needs to be challenged. So my conclusion in terms of taxation is the following. The best of all taxes is the smallest one. It's the smallest one. It is a fallacy to think that through taxation we can obtain social balance and equity. Too many taxes would be needed to have justice. I'm an economist. We have thought about it at length. This is actually a matter of annual flows of 250 billion euros if we want to eradicate poverty in a country such as France. Tax on income tax represents less than half of what we have today. So we would need to double it to make sure that we eradicate poverty on behalf of social fairness and fiscal fairness, may it be in the name of Kant, Descartes, or Rose, any kind of philosopher. And they didn't want to give an eternal definition of this. So what we have to do is to put the government back to its place. It was said earlier that the government of business shouldn't be the business of governments. They deal with too many things at once, and in terms of accounting, there's assets and liabilities. And it's actually extraordinary that we are only focusing on assets on only one side of the balance sheet. And it seems that the state is hemiplegic. We only deal with tax income, and this is not enough to eradicate poverty. So what we need to do is to take also into consideration the stated that is ours. We're not only taxpayers, and the majority of the other nationals do not pay taxes. 23 million of tax households are actually tax exempt. I'm talking about the income tax. They pay VAT, they pay a wide array of taxes. When we say they don't pay taxes, it's not true. We talk about income taxes, but we can't use VAT as a tax, as a social redistribution tool. We have 23 million taxpayers in France, so many more people are not paying taxes than those that pay tax. So we need to reshuffle our paradigms in terms of the way we approach tax, so that tax can be a real tool of redistribution if we should think that redistribution is indeed a public target, which has never been the case when it was implemented at the beginning of the years 1920, in the 20s. Thank you. That's very liberal as a point of view. So there's a social redistribution in France, which is quite significant. So Pierre SELLAL, you're chairing the Fondation de France. Would you like to follow up on this? Yes, I would like to talk in my previous capacity that you mentioned earlier as the president in Brussels. I stayed long in Brussels, and we have a reflex. We compare the situation of France with such of our partners. And in this field, what is striking in terms of public deficits, it's actually the discrepancies and the frauds. When we talk about public deficit, it's the highest in the Eurozone when we talk about France. And this was actually recalled by the higher audit court. This is among the highest in the Eurozone. And it continues to grow and has been continuing to grow for 3 years, whereas the other indebted countries like Italy and Greece and Portugal have managed to curb this ratio. And also, you've mentioned it as well, the level of mandatory levies is higher by 3 or 4 points as compared to the other Eurozone countries. So that gives us a hint of a conclusion. It's not a matter of excessive tax moderation, but rather the fact that we have a problem with it. And we should actually go closer to the European average. So it's a matter of public spending that needs to be looked upon. Keep the mic close to your mouth. So we need to make savings, and we need to be selective in our public spending. Over the last 20 years, the share of spending that is necessary, retirement and health, actually they've lost 2 GDP points, whereas for education, for instance, they decreased by 1 point of GDP point. So we need to be more focused and more selective in our approach. I would like to ask you a question that was actually alluded to by Pierre earlier on. You're the president of the main body, which is the most well-known by the French people, asking for the generosity of the public against the background of the efforts that are looked for in 2026. The government could challenge partly or have a ceiling in terms of tax deductions of private individuals or companies, and also for the real estate wealth tax that facilitates donations to charity, public interest charities. So what do you think about this as the president of Fondation de France? And it's the first time that you hear in X and that you speak on this subject further to this announcement in the press. It would be a very bad omen for anything relating to philanthropy and charity in France. Donations, especially from companies, amount to 9 billion euros. And when we talk about tax spending, we're talking about 3 billion euros. So what we have to remember at all times is donations always have a cost. Sometimes we represent this as a means to be exempted from the donation itself. No. The exemption never reaches the totality of the donation. So what you pay is higher to what you would have paid. I'm sorry, the interpreter cannot hear everything that the gentleman is saying. So also it shows that there's a correlation between the donation amount, the proportion of the donation, even if it's always voluntary, and the tax assistance, the tax adjustments related to it. They pretend that there's an elasticity of the donation as regards to the tax treatment. We've had the experience during the replacement of the ISF by IFI from the income wealth tax to the real estate wealth tax. So if there's a challenge of the tax treatment, there will be a diminution of the donations accordingly. But what I think what we should do is that this tax spending is at once justified and necessary. It is profitable, first of all, because the economic effect of philanthropic donation with the ancillary effect of volunteer work goes actually far and beyond the tax burden. And also it's a tax spending which is socially virtuous because it prompts each and every one to bring a contribution to common interest. And it's also a necessary tax spending. Why? Because considering the disengagement of the state in the cultural field, in research that was mentioned earlier, in many fields of the education or social realm, and there's not really a willingness to substitute this by philanthropy, but rather to try to complete investment in culture and research. And there's not only a matter of consent to donation. Donation is always on a volunteer basis. So what I hear is that you're not in favor to this prospect. You have understood me fully. Thank you.
Mr. N.K. Singh, President of the Institute for Economic Growth in India. So we'll expand our view in this period where we have tendency to fall back into our own prospects in our countries. A country with very strong growth, much stronger growth than France, but with real social challenges also. So how do you see this balance between tax treatment and social justice and growth?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is the first time that I'm participating in a conference of this nature. And I greatly value this opportunity. With my colleague, who is, of course, the head of the Treasury in Uganda, and India, which is now the world's most populous country, 1.4 billion people, growing at an average of 7% in real terms, which in nominal terms, as the bankers would tell you, would be in the region of about 10.5 to 11% per annum, with a fiscal deficit which we have managed to control and keep it in certain limits, and an amazing symmetry of macroeconomic policies between monetary authorities and fiscal authorities. I have first, with your permission, Mr. Moderator, 3 points to make, and I'll make them briefly. First and foremost, I think a generic treatment of this subject in presenting as a dual choice, growth versus taxation, is a false choice. I think that the authorities face what I called the impossible trinity. Impossible trinity, as my economists would know, has been used in the context of central bankers. But I think that this impossible trinity exists more in the context of policy makers. Why? The difficulty is that countries which are capital deficient, like the countries of the South in general, India also is a capital deficient country, has one important challenge of having tax structures which would be favorable to fresh investment, to inward capital flows, and act as a powerful incentive of further enhancing the capability of India's large corporate sector, both large, small, and medium. This is one particular aspect. The second particular aspect is, as you rightly pointed out, how does one in this process balance out the need of enticing capital, enticing investment, along with the compulsions of enhancing public outlays on public infrastructure, on health, on education, and ensuring that large parts of rural India, which have still not got out of poverty. Though, by the way, Mr. Moderator, I must tell you that we have this spectacular record of having pulled out 270 million people in 10 years from out of abject poverty. And this, by the way, in the enhanced definition of the World Bank, where the poverty definition itself has changed now to 3.14, certainly $2.5 per day. How does one really, therefore, have enough resources to support large public outlays? And that is a second challenge. The third important challenge, as was rightly being pointed out here in a different context, the challenge of equity, inclusiveness, and combining the virtues of inclusiveness and equity in what I called a morally valuable model to balance out these three. Now, the one broad conclusion, two broad conclusions which I reach, is there are no fixed paradigms. One rule doesn't fit all. What would be true for large developed economies would not be true for countries which are developing countries and lower middle income countries like India, which have a long way to go. So that is one rule doesn't fit all. The example of France is fascinating to me. I must begin also, Mr. Moderator, that my very good friend Emily Marchelin, whom I'm meeting 2 days from now, she has done a remarkable effort in seeking to strike this balance. French debt is 114% of national GDP. This is far in excess of acceptable averages. She has done and used the tools in a very transparent way, enhance revenues and cut down on public spending. Not a very popular decision, but perhaps the goals of macroeconomic stability of France would compel further movement in this direction. When it comes to India, I would say 2 points which are, Mr. Moderator, I'd like to make before I close my closing initial remarks. First and foremost, as the chairman of the committee that was set up to redo the international financial architecture, where along with my good friend Larry Summers, President Emeritus of Harvard University, we gave a report which was accepted by the G20, accepted by the French presidency. In fact, President Macron played a very important role. One of the important features there is countries must adopt across the board internationally accepted norms. And if internationally accepted norms, like for instance a minimum rate of corporate taxes, which they had been recommended at 15%, a certain tax on the very rich, a certain way in which the roles of equity and justice are there, this must be embedded in an international agreement, which it was, but it has been reopened, Mr. Moderator, which you know, during the last 3 months, where the United States, which is a large recipient of many of this, has resiled from its commitment on that international agreement on minimum rates of corporate taxes and on certain taxes on the very rich. So the point is, countries today are far too integrated in a value-added chain to act on taxation in a disaggregated way without acting really in tandem with others. That is why I call it the impossible trinity. One final comment. We have succeeded in India in achieving this kind of a symmetry, notwithstanding geopolitical and other uncertainties, in fostering high rates of economic growth, higher amounts of public outlay, and keeping key macroeconomic parameters like fiscal deficit and debt within acceptable limits. Thank you.
Merci de cette première.
Thank you for this first introductory speech. We'll pass the microphone now to Ramathan GGOOBI, who's the Treasury Secretary from Uganda. Do you have the same vision as your colleague does? And KESSLER, do you look at you have a country where the poverty is substantial, and we in France, despite a high level of prosperity, we're also dealing with problems, trying to find a balance between fiscal taxation revenue and growth. How do you manage this?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. I should say that some words like fairness do not augur well with economists. They may be very good words for philosophers and poets and clergy. But sometimes we ask, what is fair? Is it fair to tax disproportionately high the rich so that we can give the money to the poor? Perhaps the poor might have also a right for a good living, a good life. But do you want to promote that kind of trend? Economists have had these debates. I don't want to go back into those controversies. But what I wanted to say is that, number one, countries like mine are grappling, first of all, with how do we broaden the tax base so that we get as many people as possible to contribute their fair share to the tax revenue, which we need to provide public goods. And among these public goods, I should say, redistribution is one of them. When you have an economy where the economic difference between the high incomes and the lower incomes is shrinking, you are really having a very good public good, even to those who are higher income. I used to tell my colleagues when I was in academia that usually in Uganda and in many other parts of Africa, the poor do not sleep because they are hungry, and the rich do not sleep because the poor are awake. So you find the entire society not having a good sleep. And therefore there is need for redistribution as a public good. I'll make 3 points. Number one, if we want to promote that good balance between growth and fair taxation, we need, first of all, to adhere to the principles of good taxation, principles of good tax policy. What I found is that in modern economies, we tend to do policy informed more by politics and emotions and other things other than the foundational principles of good taxation. And we know them. I don't want to bore you by repeating them. So we should avoid the short-sighted kind of distortionary interventions that we usually make within our policies that end up causing more trouble in our countries. Secondly, contrary to the literature and the IMF, you know, I will mention IMF here because it's like a common playbook. Whenever I interface with the IMF, they tell me, go and remove tax expenditures, remove tax exemptions. But these exemptions are meant to attract capital, which the old man here has talked about. And when I get investment in a capital-constrained country, I create jobs. I'll be able to raise incomes. And in essence, I'm redistributing the incomes. There is no way you are going to have good investments in Uganda and in the global south when you don't provide certain incentives to these investors. So there is a need for us to understand, and we've done that in Uganda, and we found that taxation is an appropriate fiscal policy tool for redistribution. Finally, I wanted also us to understand that when we strengthen the targeting of tax exemptions and tax waivers, you are likely to, for example, I will give you an example of zero rating of VAT for particular goods. In Uganda, we zero rate the goods which are consumed by the poor. We zero rate cereals, we zero rate medicines for the poor, we zero rate also things like like education materials. These have been found to be effective in helping the poor to access the kind of goods that they would have found it very difficult to access, much as we trade off some kind of efficacy, some efficiency, because sometimes the high-income people also benefit. But I should say it is a good trade-off to pay. I thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now turn to Véronique MILLISCHER. As was said earlier by KESSLER, from your point of view, what do you think about the possibility of setting up a minimum tax on multinationals that seemed to have been in an international agreement that is now challenged by the United States and that Mr. Singh made reference to? Is this a type of demand that we're giving to the biggest companies that have tax optimization tools that allow them to pay less tax than others, and we know who we're speaking of here, and they create consensus in the rest of society because there's a type of justice, because the richest people and companies cannot be exonerated from the collective tax effort that is asked for? Yes, the OECD many years ago started dealing with this topic because company taxation was national, and so it opened the possibility for tax optimization because certain companies were proposing regimes that were more favorable than others. So there's an aspect that is fighting against a tax fraud. We won't go into that. Measures have been strengthened to fight against this recently. But indeed, there are inequalities that my co-panelists have talked about. And there's Pillar 2, which is a great unknown for big companies. It's the proposal of a minimum tax of 15%. So the rate of taxation on companies in France is 25%. We don't reach that level in this. It's 15%. But this allows us to be on equal footing with other countries that have very low taxation levels. There was a great consensus at the beginning. 140 countries signed the agreement. The big problem was that the United States never signed, because obviously when you go into the details of this Pillar 2 system, you had to understand who pays the complement and how you can calculate a 15% tax for a group. So this is for the big international groups, over 700 million euros of turnover. So how can we determine the base? And the second aspect of this is when the company pays less than 15% total tax, who has to pay the complementary taxation level? And the Americans are very against this, saying there's no way that there's another country that's going to be collecting the gap between the 15% and what the group is paying at home. So there was a strong push. Well before Donald Trump was reelected, the United States had never really adhered to this movement. It was always the question mark that was still in place. But it was going in the right direction. And after the election of Donald Trump, there was a complete 180 on this question because he didn't want this international regulation to be implemented. Right now, because he's threatened retortion, punishing measures to any country that applies this to the U.S. There's a consensus to say the United States will be exempted from this firstly, but they're not out of the system, so that's a good thing. And the system will apply to all the other countries. So this is progress to more equality on tax rates worldwide. Mr. Singh would like to react.
Sur ce point.
No, I think that I entirely agree with you that if the United States doesn't want to adhere to it, the fact that other countries, there is a broad agreement on that, is a positive move forward. Because otherwise, I want to pose two issues to you. How does one live in an era where tax arbitrage, treaty shopping, and volatility of investment is a permanent feature of overall global matrix? And that would make the job of central bankers in really managing the currency rates in a reasonable way much more complex than even it is today. So if the United States doesn't want to be, that's a major issue. Second issue is, and this is as much to you, Mr. Moderator, is tarifa, which we hadn't heard of till Mr. Donald Trump came and reminded us of the original Italian interpretation of what tariff meant. It was called tarifa, which we know. Is that a tax? Is it a tax on international trade? Is it a tax on questioning the value of trade as an engine of growth and as a multiplier which brings huge benefits to the economies? How does one treat this new animal of tarifa, which we see confronted, and with which countries after countries, including mine right now as we speak today, including the EU and others, are grappling with it? This is a new phenomena which multiplies the inherent contradictions in being able to have an orderly international regime.
Très intéressant, la question que vous...
That's very interesting, the issue you're raising. Maybe you have an international vision on this debate of customs tariffs that could be seen as a break, but also as an opportunity. This is how the US presented to rearm themselves in terms of domestic growth. Yes, in a period of the end of the world order and globalization as we know it. Yes, first of all, Mr. Singh is totally right when he insists on the need for international cooperation on these issues, especially the taxation of multinationals. But we see against this backdrop that the EU is not is not leading by example here. The free circulation of capitals, of services, of goods, of humans has triggered a transfer of taxation to the detriment of fixed factors and alleviating the factors on mobile factors. And this is why the average taxation rate has decreased everywhere in Europe. Same thing for the marginal rate of income tax and also the average wealth tax rate. And so we consider in Europe that tax competition amongst states was something that was legitimate, that was normal, and that led to that situation where we transfer against fair taxation, as you mentioned, so as to increase tax revenue towards some countries to the detriment of others. So I think that the EU should actually put some order in their own area before talking about the others. Gérard BEKERMAN, you actually set aside the idea of fair taxation for the construction of our tax structure. And we see that in France there's a lot of questioning, and in a period of high budget tension to manage to ask efforts from each and every one, we have to ask more efforts from some population groups. This is why we have to deal with inheritance tax, life insurance tax. Why not? So I try to provoke you to prompt a response from you. So for the 0.01% that pays less tax than the middle class proportionally, we need to have a regime which shows that they are making efforts. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. How do you apply fair taxation? Well, in the following manner, we have to go back to a tax conscience. And as far as I'm concerned, this relies upon justice and equity that is not only social, but also civic. As a citizen, we have to go beyond the idea of money, savings, wealth, the financial aspect of tax. What is tax? I sleep, I wake up in the morning, And it is unpleasant to tell oneself, I'm going to work more than 1 day out of 2 for my neighbor. When my neighbor is a member of the family, it's all is well. But when my neighbor is a friend that shares my values in a society and for daily life, I'm fine. But when my neighbor is opposed to my values, does not share my values, how could we have consent to tax? And we cannot be surprised to see that there's a contestation, a challenge of taxation. And I think we have to go back to a world that is not more tainted by financial aspects, but rather to say our lives belong to us. That allows us to establish civic fairness and equity, to contribute, as my neighbor does at the Fondation France, when he contributes to all kinds of charity actions, to value cultural heritage, to give meaning to our life. And I will give you the floor in a moment. We have 8 minutes 45 left, and I would like you to have a Q&A session. Please be brief when you ask your questions, when you raise your hand. We'll start with the gentleman. Yes, do we have a mic? Yeah. So if there are 2 mics, then we can prepare for the second question, maybe, ahead of time. I saw the gentleman on the 4th row. Please hand him a mic. Please introduce yourself in a second, though. Very briefly. Dominique Bedoc, I'm a teacher, SES, in economic and social science. I'm surprised by the declaration of some of you who oppose to justice and would rather urge upon charity. I think this is where the emergency is. It's a social emergency, it's a political emergency, it's an environmental emergency. If we do not address this emergency in a radical way, the risk at hand is that we will have difficult tomorrow. And we see it at the Cercle des économistes. In 5 years, we certainly have people being thirsty and hungry. And I think we should stop assisting with public money to assisting the real people that are assisted. Namely, when I think about those that are assisted, it's the shareholders that sleep well and tight and do not wake up in the morning to go to work. And they actually wait for the subsidies from the state to come back to them. I think we should share. And it should not be a black point in the economy now. I heard we talked about facing the reality. Well, to face reality, we need a real distribution of income. And we shouldn't mislead ourselves. Who wants to react? When we talk about social emergency, if we don't do something significant now, then rebellion is about to brew. We talk about the rising extremist parties, for instance. The topic of this meeting is the reality, which is a shock. I'm thinking about a quotation from Proust: "Facts never reach us and never manage to get inside the world of our beliefs." What happens is that you have beliefs, and I'm a statistician. I observe the facts, and I would rather have facts that will allow us to have equity and fairness for all the citizens. Of course, our CEO of the CAC 40, of the CAC 40, is lucky, and he doesn't think about his neighbor in the morning when he wakes up. But we are all here in favor of redistribution and sharing. We have to think about concrete solutions to share income whilst respecting the freedom of each and everyone. Another question, the one with the blue jersey. Please be brief as your colleague. Yeah, Serge Nardelli. I'm the General Secretary of CFDT Trade and Services. I represent a lot of employees that are in precarious situation. I would like to go back to what was said and to follow up on this regarding the first tax. That's VAT that accounts to 284 billion euros for public spending, but also for the state. The income tax is only actually 1 out of 2 French nationals pays it, but each time you pay the baguette, then you actually pay for VAT, whatever, irrespective of your revenue and income. That's the tax that dates back to more than 150 years. Where I would like to go, I would like to talk about the efforts on public spending. I agree with you on that point, but as for revenue, there's a lot of deductions from a lot of CEOs who have tax lawyers that are specialists, not so as to help them not pay the wealth tax. And I would like to talk about the Luxman tax that was denied by the Senate. So we were talking about 2% of tax, and it was taken over by the US. And they're not Keynesians. 2% is 20 billion a year on wealth of more than 100 million. So why has the Senate rejected that? That's the question I'm asking you, to each of you. We were talking about sharing. So the idea is, why should we accept such a tax? Who wants to say a word on the high net worth individuals, actually? Well, that could be meaningful and relevant because Mr. Zuckman, economist, is an economist that is widely acknowledged and well reputed, but it should be a world tax for it to work. So we would need an agreement by each and everyone worldwide to impose that levy, because otherwise what would happen, we'll have some countries that will enforce it and some won't. And then you will reinforce even further tax optimization willingness, and this is why the Senate denied it. Is there a last question? Hands are being raised. The gentleman in the back. Why? I like gender equality. Why do the ladies do not ask questions as well? So briefly, please. So if one of your lady colleagues wants to take the floor, we'll give priority to the other sex. My name is Hervé Goulet-Kerr. I'm economist, and I had a question. You're well known. I had a question on the scope of levies, because you said that we were the champions of Europe in terms of mandatory contributions, but when we talk about levies that will fund common interest spending, we also have insurance policies that are personal, like retirements, like unemployment benefits. Why don't we put everyone in front of their responsibilities, the retired people on the one hand, the unemployed on the other? Maybe we should be more straightforward in what we talk about when we talk about contributions, so as to reduce the deficit, if there's one, in a more straightforward manner. Having a common pool with different things, well, I think that actually increases the complexity of management, and I don't think it's a good thing. You're talking about retirement funds, right? No, not only. Is there a last question? A comment to express, because we have 1 minute from Ramathan Gobi, because in France we don't have the same problems of poverty levels, and yet these social emergency issues and just like climate emergency and deficit issues actually shake our society. How do you react to these concerns that were expressed in the room? You have 44 seconds.
That fundamentally the bottom line for me is that in the pursuit of fairness, we should avoid discouraging, number one, risk-taking. Number two, know-how movement. We need to get the know-how into the country and keep it. But also we need to ensure that the risk-takers do not start to move around searching for where they can easily be accepted with their risks. I thank you.
D'un mot, Pierre Boyer.
One word, Pierre Boyer. What is the takeaway message for you about what was said during these 55 minutes? First of all, I can see that a lot of you are interested in this subject when we have scorching heat outside. And may it be for public spending or tax, they need to fulfill the right objective. So we need to have an assessment of public segments. We need to have facts and to have a democratic debate, and we'll have to start with the right elements of facts. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for having participated in this debate. I would like to thank McKenzie and Ramathan who traveled from far, far away to come all the way to here. Thank you to all of you for your attention.